everybody. This is Jason again. I'm the founder and co-owner of Copperworks Distilling. Thanks for joining us again. We have been talking about the process of making whiskey. And for the past couple of weeks, we did a tour for everything. And then last week, we talked specifically about malt. This week, we're going to talk about brewing. We're also going to have future segments on fermentation and then distillation, deep dives into that, deep dives into barreling. But today is all about the brewing and the brewing partners we have. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what distilling does in case you're not completely sure about that. Distilling does not create alcohol. What distilling does is concentrate alcohol. So the way you make alcohol is through fermentation. So the first thing that we have to do is to brew something to then ferment it. What we're trying to do is to make sugar that yeast to consume, turn that into alcohol, and then we'll distill it. So we talked about the malting process last week, and that's available online if you want to go back and review that. This week we're going to talk about the actual brewing, that is taking those malts and then converting them into something that we call a beer. The first thing that I also need to do, or maybe it's the second thing I need to do, is now that we've talked about what we're doing with brewing, is how we differ from some other places. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about our background. Micah and I were both brewers. I was a professional brewer, and we were both home brewers. We've been making beer together about 60 years. Okay, we haven't been together for 60 years, but 30 years apiece making homebrew. Also professionally brewing. I've been professionally brewing since 1989. So when we decided to make Copperworks, we decided to make a really high quality beer that we then turned into whiskey, vodka, and gin. Brewing is a whole skill. When we opened up this distillery, we were going to build a brewery right here and have our stills here. But one of the challenges with building a brewery is that you have to have great big silos to store the grain for the size we were going to be. And this, right after we signed the lease, this became a historic landmark. That made it very difficult for us to put silos out front because the historic landmark board said that we couldn't do that. It would break the lines of the now historic building. So we had to come up with another way to do brewing. We thought about crazy ways of doing silos inside the building. That didn't work, but the best option was to actually partner with one of many of our friend breweries. So my first brewery was the Pike Place Brewery back in 1989. I was hired as their first brewer, worked with them for a long time, ended up getting a desire to go back to school and get chemistry and microbiology. And right before I left, I hired a fellow named Dick Cantwell. Dick went on to open up the Elysium Breweries. He was one of the 3 founding members of the Elysium Breweries. I've brewed in several other breweries, including Red Hook and brewmaster at Pyramid Breweries for about 7 years. But those 2 first breweries I mentioned are brewers we still work with, the Pike Place Brewery and the Elysium Brewery. We also work with Fremont Brewing Company. So in a strange thing to do for a live show, I'm actually going to show you some photos in a minute. But first, I want to get back to this brewing concept. So what I've done as a brewer, what Micah has been doing as a brewer, and what Copperworks still does is brew a high quality beer. To make a high quality beer, you take malted barley and then crack it into what's called grist. Come over here, Tom. Let's take a look at a couple of things. I've got here a bunch of different grains. We talked about different grains last week. One thing I forgot to mention to you is how those different grains can be processed. So I'm going to review that real quickly. If you take a look here, you'll see that this is corn. These are corn kernels. That's the way a number 2 dent corn. This is what almost every bourbon distillery uses to make bourbon or corn whiskey. It's frequently turned into corn grist. I think this is called flaked corn. But you can also make it into powdered corn. This is flour, and that's in fact what most big distilleries use, is a flour that they're making bourbon out of. You can do the same with rye, but you normally don't do it in this form. You do it either as a flour or as a flaked rye. You can do it with, these are distilling malts. I'll talk about that in a minute. You see how these have been cracked? This has been floured. here's what we start with. We start with malted barley whole kernels. We run those whole kernels through a roller mill. The roller mill cracks those kernels, gets them into a grist, something that looks a little bit like a porridge that you might have in the morning. It's not going to be nearly this crushed, but it's going to have whole grain parts in it. And the idea behind that is later we're going to use those whole grain parts to act as a natural filter bed. Here's what we do. After they're cracked, they drop into some vessel, a big stainless steel vessel called a mash tun. The mash tun we add hot water to. We stir up those grains. There are enzymes naturally occurring in the husk on that grain. Those enzymes break down the big carbohydrates that are inside each of these kernels. So if you just think about what a kernel is, and I don't mean a Kentucky kernel, I mean this type of kernel. A kernel is a seed. Inside a seed is an energy packet and a little tiny plant ready to grow. That energy packet is in the form of carbohydrates, and when that carbohydrate is broken down into small sugars, it becomes fermentable. So think about the carbohydrate as a branching tree, very complex. What yeast can eat is one tiny little unit of sugar that the branching tree is made of, millions of units. The way these enzymes in here work is they either cut the branches off the tree or they start from the ends of the branches and cut little pieces off. Those little pieces are what then become accessible for the yeast. So there's a finite amount of sugar that you can do. You can do 100% of that conversion of those enzymes breaking down those branches into small sugars. That's defined as yield. How many sugars, fermentable sized sugars, do you make from those enzymes breaking down those large complex carbohydrates? Most distilleries build their distillery around yield numbers. The higher the yield, the better the outcome, because therefore you have more potential alcohol. We build our distillery around flavor. So we actually don't measure the yield. I would tell you that it's abysmal if we knew what we were measuring, and that would cause us to want to steer by it. So we simply don't measure yield. We know it's bad. We target flavor instead. Brewers do the same thing. To a great extent, brewers are trying to make a tasty beer, not the most alcohol they can make. They could target that on some types of beer, but for the most part, they're actually more interested in the flavor, the mouthfeel, the aromas, the texture, everything about that beer comes from that base malt. So we set up a situation in the brew house called a mash schedule, where we go through stepped temperatures to activate some of those enzymes, allow some of those branches to be cut off. Now we have a whole bunch of branches flowing around, and then we cut off the tips of those branches with a different enzyme that's optimal at a different temperature. So we go through some temperature changes in order to make sure that we have the best conversion, but not complete conversion. If you ever drink a beer, you'll understand that the flavors inside the beer are coming from that malt, the texture, the body, the foam, those sorts of things you want to be in beer. You don't want them to all just be alcohol. That would get you back to one of those clear alcohol-based spirits. Remember Zima? That'd be something like that. We're not trying to make Zima. Neither is a craft brewery. The unfermented sugar seems like a wasted alcohol, but in fact is really high quality flavor components. That's why we don't do a mash schedule the way a traditional distillery does. Again, they're usually optimized for yield, not for flavor. Most big malt distilleries, which we're 100% malt, remember, most big malt distilleries are using what's called a distiller's malt. It is very, very high in enzymes, with the goal of it eating up all of those sugars, breaking apart all of those sugars and making the most fermentable product available. Or those enzymes can be used in these sorts of grains which actually don't have enzymes, like corn or wheat, to break down rice, for instance, to break down some of those sugars into fermentable sugars. We also don't add any what's called adjuncts like corn or rice. Again, 100% malted barley. So A brewery will do what's called a lauter. They'll take that liquid that comes out. Remember, we've been in a temperature-controlled mash tun for about 45 minutes to an hour. We've got these enzymes breaking down those carbohydrates into fermentable-sized sugars. We begin to strain that liquid out. I don't know if you remember me saying that we wanted to use the husks as a grain bed, but those little pieces, those shells of the husk, will literally form a layer, if we recirculate long enough, a layer on this vessel called a lauter tun. A lauter tun think of a strainer. It's a big, wide vessel that has a slotted screen base. And so all of that mash goes in, is pumped over to that, and then the liquid drains through the slots, but the solids stay up above those slots. And if you mix it up and circulate it enough, the solids will form from the heaviest ones, biggest ones on the bottom, to the lightest and tiniest ones above. So it will literally clean itself as you recirculate that. Eventually, you've got clear, sweet liquid. It's called wort, W-O-R-T. That wort strains out, and in a traditional whiskey distillery, that wort goes straight to the fermenter. In a brewery, that wort goes to a kettle. And at the kettle, you turn on heat, you boil it. Now, a brewery is boiling for 3 reasons: to sanitize, to concentrate, so they're driving out water and getting more sugar per gallon, and to add hops. We don't add hops. We're not looking for bitterness, but we are sanitizing and concentrating. That's a really big difference from what all the other distilleries do. Traditional distilleries don't do this full lautering, nor do they do that sanitizing step. What does sanitizing do? First of all, remember those enzymes that we talked about that were breaking down the carbohydrates into fermentable sized sugars? It kills them. It's a process called denaturing. It unfolds those enzymes, they no longer work. So the bad news is we're no longer getting a breakdown of sugar when we're done with the boil. Most distilleries continue to have a breakdown of sugar in that wort that they pump over into the fermenter. So even during fermentation, sugars are being created that the yeast can eat. That enzyme activity is still happening. Not with Copperworks. We treat it just like a beer. We boil to sanitize, and we boil to denature those enzymes. Why would we do that? Why would we leave alcohol, potential alcohol, behind? Again, just like beer, for mouthfeel, for aroma, for flavors that you simply can't get when you boil and when you do a partial lauter or put all of the grains into the fermenter. If you're doing a powder, let's take a look at this powder here. If you're doing a flour, there's no way you're going to have that strain out. That's all going to have to go all the way from the mash tun. It's actually at that point probably called a cereal cooker. It's then going to have to go into fermentation, and even after fermentation, it's still going to be there. It'll go into the kettle during the boil, or doing the distillation. We'll talk about distillation in another segment. So we are literally making a high quality beer, only we're not adding hops. After we've got that liquid strained out, that wort is clear, it's gone to the kettle, it's boiled for about an hour. 15 minutes is how long it takes to sanitize it for us to get the potential gravity that we want, that is the concentration of sugars in there we're going to need for about an hour boil. Our concentration for the brewers out there is either 1074 if you're thinking specific gravity, or 18 Plato if you're thinking the more German style of Plato. I wanted to show you a couple of pictures. Like I said, this is a little unusual, but this is going to be some photos of some of the breweries. First, just to give you a little background, that it was me in 1989 in a 3-barrel brew house at Pike Place Brewery. Don't ask me why I was wearing white. I can tell you it's not a good idea when you're a brewer. This is Micah and I at our very first day up at the Pike Place Brewery. They have a 30-barrel brew house, so 10 times bigger than that brewery was. They have a 30-barrel brew house. And remember, I was the first brewer up there. They've had many brewers since, and here's some of them right now, including Dean, one of our favorite guys who's no longer with us, I'm afraid. And here's Art Dixon. He's the head brewer right now. this was our very first transport. So when we're finished making that wort, we have to pump it after it's boiled and cooled. We pump it into these tanks that we drive back over here. This is me hooking up one of those tanks. But now we're partnering with much bigger breweries. This is the Elysian Brewery. So in addition to working with the Pike Place Brewery, we now work with the Elysian Brewery. You can see that each one of those vessels is twice the size of the vessel that's at the Pike Brewing. And they have a 4-vessel system. And then finally, Micah and I over here hooking up with Big Greg in the cellar of the Elysian Brewery. We had to get a bigger truck, so we put 4 totes on a 26-foot truck. Just to give you an idea, this is 26 feet back, so those are almost 4.5-foot square totes. And we now work with Fremont Brewing. Instead of being a 30-barrel brew house like the Pike Brewery or a 60-barrel brew house like the Elysian Brewery, they are an 80-barrel brew house. This is looking underneath their brewery. It's pretty complex. So why do we work with these 3 breweries? The main reason is because we get really high quality control and brewing capabilities by working with really great qualified brewers. It's one of the things that we know we can and will do. And in fact, one day, Copperworks hopes to open its own brewery. We would continue to work with brewing partners. We would continue to do really interesting beers with everybody. They could come to our brewery, we could go to their brewery, we can do everything like we do now, but we can also be the master of our own destination by brewing a lot more on our schedule than simply on their schedule. Plus, as we grow, it's going to be imperative that we can control every step along the way. So that's coming someday. Who knows, there could even be a Copperworks beer. That's not the big reason for doing this, but it's definitely a goal to always be brewers. This is the final part. I just want you to see on every bottle we write, from great brewing comes great spirits. And the reason we write that is because, in fact, it is that brewing process that differentiates Copperworks from just about every other brewery or distillery in America. This shirt, whiskey is what beer wants to be when it grows up, and that's exactly our philosophy. So thanks a lot. Next time, I think next week, Jeff will be introducing another taste panel to you, and then after that, we're going to get back into some of the science, probably a fermentation, and then move on to distillation and barrel aging. Thanks a lot, and if there's any questions, we can take those. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. We're good? Thank you. Bye.